The water is cold. It is always cold in January in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The American River runs fast here, narrow and insistent, cutting through granite and pine, and a silence so total you can hear the individual stones shifting on the riverbed. James Marshall is not listening to the stones. He is staring at one of them. He bends down. The water is maybe 6 inches deep at the edge of the mill race, the channel they've been digging to divert the river and power John Sutter's new sawmill. Marshall is the carpenter. He is here to check the channel's depth, the angle of the cut, whether the water is flowing the way it should be flowing. He is not here to find anything. But something has caught the light. Something small, flat, yellow in a way that is different from how yellow things usually look in morning light. Yellow in a way that seems to come from inside the thing rather than from the sun above it. He picks it up. It is soft. He bites it the way every man who ever doubted yellow metal bites it. It does not shatter. It bends slightly at the edge where his teeth press. He stands up. He looks at the empty hills around him, the pine trees, the gray sky just beginning to show color at its edges, the river running cold and indifferent around his boots. Nobody is watching. James Marshall is standing in a California river on a Tuesday morning in January, holding a piece of gold the size of his thumbnail, and the world does not yet know what is about to happen to it. He does not shout. He does not run. He stands very still. And then, quietly, with the particular dread of a man who suspects that his luck has just run out in the worst possible way, he puts it in his pocket. Before we go any further, I need you to remember something. You've been here before.
He found it.
Not here, exactly. Not California. Not 1,848. But you've stood at this moment before in this series. You watched a Dutch merchant hold a tulip bulb up to the light in 1637 and see not a flower, but a fortune. You watched Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest mind of his century, buy South Sea Company shares and lose everything he had. You watched Eleanor Marsh stand on a Victorian railway platform in 1845, clutching share certificates that would be worthless before the year was out. Different centuries, different assets, different continents. Same story. The pattern crossed the Atlantic. It found new land, new mountains, new rivers full of the oldest. Promise in the world. A new word for wealth. Gold. California. 1,848. And here is the thing about gold, the thing that makes this particular mania different from the ones that came before it. The tulips were real, but they were flowers. The South Sea Company's promise was fictional from the very beginning. The railways were real, but you couldn't hold a railway in your hand. Gold is different. Gold is heavy. Gold is cold. Gold doesn't rot, and it doesn't rust, and it doesn't promise anything, it simply is. There is nothing speculative about the weight of it in your palm. James Marshall was not holding a dream. He was holding gold. The question, as it has always been, in every episode of this story, was never whether the thing was real. The question was, who would get rich from it? And the answer, as always, would not be the man standing in the mud. To understand what Marshall found, you first need to understand the man who owned the land he found it on. John Augustus Sutter. Swiss-born, 45 years old in 1848. Broad, fleshy-faced, with thinning sandy hair and blue eyes that had once looked ambitious and now looked afraid. He had arrived in California in 1839 with nothing but debts he'd left behind in Switzerland and a talent for convincing powerful men to trust him. He sweet-talked the Mexican governor of California into granting him 50,000 acres in the Sacramento Valley. He built a fort. He grew wheat. He raised cattle. He hired workers, built irrigation systems, and over 9 years constructed something genuinely impressive, New Helvetia, his own private agricultural empire in the middle of the California wilderness. He was not a good man, particularly. He kept indigenous Californians as near enslaved labor. He manipulated land claims. He borrowed money he had no intention of repaying. But he had built something real. And the sawmill at Coloma was the next phase. Timber for the settlements he intended to build. A practical, profitable expansion of a practical, profitable empire. He did not need what his carpenter found in the mill race. When Marshall rode through a rainstorm to reach him 2 days after the discovery, soaking wet, barely coherent with excitement, Sutter's face did not light up. It went white. Because Sutter understood something that Marshall did not. He understood that gold in your own river is not a blessing. It is an invasion you cannot stop. They made a pact, Sutter and Marshall. Finish the mill. Honor the 6-week work contract with the laborers. Keep it quiet until they could figure out what they had and what to do with it and how to protect it. It was a reasonable plan. It lasted approximately 4 days. The mill workers knew. They told their friends. Their friends told their families. By February, the word was moving through the settlements around Sacramento, like water moving downhill, finding every crack, filling every low space. Sutter tried to obtain a mining lease from the local California government. He was told that under the recent American acquisition of California, no such lease existed. He had no legal protection. His land was not, technically, his land not in the way he needed it to be, not for this. By March 1848, a Mormon merchant in San Francisco had received enough information to take it seriously. He sent a man to Coloma to confirm. The man came back with a bag of gold dust and an expression that said everything. The merchant's name was Sam Brannan. And what Sam Brannan did next would make him the richest man in California without ever once picking up a pan. Here is what Sam Brannan understood that almost nobody else did in the spring of year 1848. He understood that the gold itself was irrelevant. Not because it wasn't real, it was real. The rivers were full of it, just sitting in the gravel, waiting. But the gold was in the ground, and getting it out of the ground required labor, and labor required tools, and tools had to be bought from someone. Before Sam Brannan told a single living soul what he had learned about the American River, before he breathed a word of it to anyone, he went to every supply store in San Francisco and bought everything. Every pick, every shovel, every gold pan, every sluice box, every length of rope and bolt of canvas and sack of flour and pound of salt pork he could find. He cleaned out the merchants of Northern California. And then he walked into the streets of San Francisco, holding a glass vial of gold dust above his head, and he shouted at the top of his preacher's lungs, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." San Francisco emptied. Within days, 3/4 of the men in the city had left for the hills. Businesses closed. Ships sat unmanned in the harbor. The local newspaper suspended publication because its entire staff had gone to Coloma. The alcalde, the city's mayor, wrote that he had walked through San Francisco and found it deserted. Doors hanging open, fires still burning in hearths, meals half-eaten on tables. The city had simply left. And Sam Brannan's store, the only store for hundreds of miles, with picks and shovels and pans in stock, made $36,000 in a single month. Roughly $1.5 million in today's money. From a discovery he hadn't made. On land he didn't own. He never dug a single pan. He never needed to. What happened in California in the early 1848 was a local event. Californians, Oregonians, a few Mexicans, some Mormon settlers, several thousand men at most. The easy gold was plentiful enough that it could have stayed a regional story, a curiosity, a brief excitement, a modest enrichment of the Sacramento Valley before the rivers ran dry and everyone went home. What transformed it into a global mania was a single speech. President James K. Polk, the 5th of December, 1848, his annual address to Congress. He had just won California from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. He needed Congress to fund its governance. He needed the American public to believe the West was worth having. He needed politically, desperately for California to feel like a prize. And now he had his prize. He told Congress, on the record, in official language, with the full weight of the American presidency behind it. The gold discovery was real. The scale was extraordinary. The opportunity was unlike anything the nation had seen before. It was the most consequential press release in American history. Ships began loading within weeks. In New York, in Boston, in London, in Sydney, in Canton, in Santiago, in Paris. Men who had never heard of the Sierra Nevada were booking passage to a place they could not find on a map, to dig up a thing they had never seen, in a country they barely understood. The 49ers were coming. All of them, all at once. Who were the 49ers? Let me tell you who they were, because they were not adventurers, not primarily. They were not the rugged, self-reliant pioneers that American mythology later made of them. They were desperate. Clerks who hated their desks. Farmers whose land had failed 2 seasons in a row. Young men from Ireland who had watched their families starve during the famine and arrived in America with nothing and found that nothing had followed them here. Veterans of the Mexican-American War who had come home to no jobs and no prospects. German immigrants, Italian immigrants, French immigrants who had crossed one ocean already and were prepared to cross another if the mathematics justified it. And the mathematics, on paper, looked extraordinary. A laborer in New York earned $1 a day. The stories coming out of California said a man could pull $20, $30, $50 a day from a good claim on the American River. 50 times your current wage. For a man with debts and a family and no prospects, that is not a gamble. That is a moral obligation. That is the only rational choice. You sell what you have. You borrow what you need. You leave your wife and children a promise and a date. I will be back by Christmas. I will be back by spring. I will be back with enough to change everything, and you go. Most of them were in their late 20s. Most were leveraged to the point of fragility. Most had borrowed money for the journey itself, which meant they were already in debt before they ever reached California. They were not chasing a dream. They were running from a nightmare. And California, for most of them, was simply the nightmare in a different language. There were 3 routes to California in 1849, and every one of them was trying to kill you. The overland trail west across the continent, through the Great Plains, over the Rocky Mountains, through Nevada's deserts, and finally the Sierra Nevada passes. 6 months, if everything went well. Cholera on the plains, exposure in the mountains. Starvation if your supplies ran out, which they often did. The name Donner Pass, where a party of emigrants had resorted to cannibalism just 2 years earlier, hung over every wagon train like a curse. Around Cape Horn by ship, 5 to 8 months of ocean. Scurvy, storms off the southern tip of South America that could drive a ship backward for weeks. Fares of $300 to $500 real money, borrowed money for most men who paid it. Through Panama, the fastest route and the most lethal. Cross the Caribbean to the Isthmus, push through 60 miles of jungle to the Pacific coast, board another ship north. The jungle crossing took days in heat and rain, and mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. Hundreds of men died on that isthmus before they ever saw California. By the time the average 49er arrived in San Francisco, he had been traveling for months. He was exhausted. He was sick, or recently sick. He had spent half his borrowed stake on the journey itself,
he was already losing, and he hadn't even started. William Tecumseh Sherman arrived in California in September 1848 as a young Army lieutenant. He was 28 years old, lean and angular, with red-brown hair and the precise, observational mind that would later make him one of history's most formidable generals. He watched San Francisco transform in real time, and he wrote about it. Letters home, dispatches. Later, a memoir with the clarity of a man who understood that he was watching something that had no precedent and would leave no template. In the early 1848, San Francisco was a village of fewer than 1,000 people. Adobe buildings on a cold bay, a sleepy port, a small garrison, the smell of salt water and cattle. By year 1850, it was a city of 36,000. Think about what that means. 35 times its population in less than 2 years. Faster than any city in American history had ever grown. Faster, perhaps, than any city in the world had ever grown. Ships from every port on earth sat abandoned in the harbor. Their crews had jumped overboard and run for the gold fields the moment they docked. By 1850, there were more than 500 abandoned ships in San Francisco Bay. Some were dragged ashore and converted into warehouses. Some were filled with landfill and built over the foundations of a new city sitting on the hulls of the ships that had brought men to it. Land prices had multiplied 50 times in 18 months. A lot that sold for $16 in 1847 sold for $45,000 in 1849. Gambling houses ran 24 hours. Saloons ran 24 hours. Everything ran 24 hours because the city never slept, because the men who came to it were too afraid to sleep, because sleep was time and time was gold, and gold was the only reason any of them were here. Sherman watched all of it. He wrote, "I have never seen anything like this, and I believe I never will again." He was right. But he was also wrong about what it meant, because he was watching the same thing that had happened in Amsterdam in 1637, in London in 1720, in the English railway towns of year 1845. He just didn't know it yet. Now let me tell you what it was actually like, not the myth. Not the Harper's Weekly illustrations of ruddy, grinning prospectors up to their knees in gold-bearing gravel. Not the Courier and Ives prints of men striking it rich beneath a California sun. The actual camps, placer mining swirling gravel in a pan to separate gold from sediment by its density, required no skill. Anyone could do it. This was, in theory, its great democratic promise. No experience necessary, no capital required, just a pan and a strong back, and the willingness to stand in cold river water for 14 hours a day. The best claims on the American River, the Feather River, the Trinity River, the claims where a man could genuinely pull $50 a day from the gravel, were staked within months of the rush beginning. Men who arrived in 1848, who were there before Polk's speech sent the world flooding in, those men made money, real money. Some of them made fortunes. The men who arrived in 1849, the 49ers, the great mass of them, the ones the rush is named for, they got the leavings. The camps had no law, no courts, no police, no doctors, no sanitation. Scurvy was rampant. Fresh vegetables were nearly impossible to obtain and cost extraordinary prices when they could be found. Dysentery swept through camps that had dug their latrines too close to their water supply. Mining accidents, cave-ins, rock falls, men crushed by sluice equipment killed hundreds, with no compensation and no record. And beneath all of this, a racial hierarchy enforced with violence that made the democratic mythology of the gold rush look like exactly what it was, mythology. Chinese miners who had come in their thousands from Guangdong province, who were often the most technically skilled and industrious miners in the fields, were taxed at rates that made profitable mining impossible, then harassed from their claims, then beaten, then killed, with no legal protection and no recourse. Chilean miners were expelled by force. Mexican miners, many of whom had been California residents before the Americans arrived, were driven off land they had legitimate claim to by men with guns, and the particular confidence of those who believe the law will eventually catch up to what they have already done. The camps were not the American frontier of legend. They were what men do to each other when there is no one watching. Now I want to give you the number that changes everything. In the summer of the year 1849, in the mining camps of the Sierra Nevada foothills, a single egg cost $1. A pound of flour cost $4. Boots, the heavy leather boots, a miner absolutely required, cost $100. A shovel cost $10. A simple iron pan cost $15. In New York, a shovel cost 75 cents. The men who were getting rich in California in 1849 were not miners. They were the people who understood that the gold rush had created the most captive consumer market in the history of American commerce. Men who had no choice but to buy, at any price, the things they needed to survive and to work. The boarding house owners who charged miners $40 a week for a bunk and 2 meals. The laundresses who charged $8 per shirt because men who spent 14 hours in a river didn't wash their own clothes and made more in a month than most miners made in a year. The cook who opened a restaurant in Sacramento in 1849 and charged $1 per meal and had a line out the door from 6 in the morning to midnight. The lawyers. This is the one nobody talks about. The mining camps had no formal property rights, no established claim system, no legal framework for who owned what. The moment serious money was involved, that vacuum filled with disputes. And disputes required lawyers. The attorneys who set up practice in Sacramento and San Francisco in 1849 and 1850 became among the wealthiest men in California, charging fees that would stagger a modern Wall Street firm to men who had no choice but to pay them. The pattern is the same one you've seen in this series before. In every bubble, in every mania, the people who profit most are not the ones who take the risk. They are the ones who stand at the entrance and charge admission. They are the ones who sell the dream to the people who need to believe in it. The gold was real. The opportunity was real. But the opportunity was not in the ground. It never was.
Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853. Late by gold rush standards, the easy placers were already exhausted. The great wave of 49ers had already crashed and receded. A more cautious man might have looked at California in 1853 and decided he'd missed it. Strauss was 20 years old, slight, quiet, serious, with dark brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. A Bavarian Jewish immigrant who had watched his older brothers build a dry goods business in New York and decided to bring the same business to the West Coast. He brought bolts of heavy canvas cloth, originally intended for tent-making durable, cheap to produce, easy to transport. What he discovered when he arrived in the camps and talked to the miners was that they destroyed their trousers. Not occasionally, constantly. The work, the kneeling, the crouching, the constant contact with rock and gravel and water shredded ordinary trousers in weeks. Men were working in rags. Men were paying extraordinary prices for replacement clothing they'd go through in a month. Strauss began making trousers from his canvas. They held. Word spread through the camps with the particular velocity of practical solutions among desperate men. Later, working with a Nevada tailor named Jacob Davis, he added metal rivets at the stress points, the pockets, the belt loops, the places ordinary stitching failed. The rivets distributed the force. The trousers became nearly indestructible. He patented the design in 1873. Levi Strauss never went near a mine, never panned a single stream, never spent a night in a camp or a day in the cold water of the American River. He died in 1902, worth $6 million. The gold was in the pockets, literally. In 1852, California extracted $81 million worth of gold from its rivers and hills. $81 million. That is approximately $3 billion in today's money. In a single year, from a state that 5 years earlier had been a Mexican territory with a population of roughly 14,000 non-indigenous people. I want to pause here and give this moment its full weight, because there is a version of the California Gold Rush story that treats the whole thing as pure illusion, as mania without substance, as mass delusion dressed in denim, and that would be wrong. The gold was real. The transformation was real. California's population in 1852 was 250,000 people. San Francisco was the fastest growing city in the world. The infrastructure being built, roads, ports, banks, telegraph lines, the beginnings of what would become the American West's commercial skeleton, was real and durable and would outlast every miner who built it. Unlike the South Sea Company, whose entire asset was a lie, unlike the tulip market, whose asset was a flower, the California Gold Rush had gold. And it had it in quantities that the world had not seen since the Spanish looted the Americas 3 centuries before. The tragedy, and here is the specific, precise tragedy of this particular bubble, is not that the gold didn't exist. It is that it existed in staggering abundance, and 90% of the men who came for it died with nothing. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. We don't do surface-level history. We go inside the machine and show you how it worked and why it always breaks the same way. Subscribe now, hit the bell, because what's coming in the second half of this story is darker than anything we've covered so far. The gold rush doesn't end with men going home empty-handed. It ends with men being destroyed. And the men who are destroyed most completely are the ones who deserved it least. By the end of 1852, the placer deposits were done. Not entirely there was gold left in California's earth, enormous quantities of it, but it was no longer sitting in river gravel, waiting to be swirled out with a pan. It was buried in hillsides, locked in quartz rock, dispersed through gravel beds at depths that no individual miner with hand tools could reach. What it required was capital. Hydraulic mining arrived in 1853. The technology was staggering in its aggression. Enormous iron nozzles called monitors, fed by miles of canvas hose connected to mountain reservoirs, blasting water at pressures of several hundred pounds per square inch directly into the faces of hills. Not digging, destroying. Entire mountainsides dissolved, valleys filled with debris. The water that had carried the gold also carried everything else: topsoil, boulders, gravel, the remnants of forests and ecosystems that had taken 10,000 years to develop into the rivers below, into the Sacramento Valley, into the farms and fields of men who had nothing to do with gold and never had. The individual prospector, the democratic hero of the gold rush mythology, the free man with his pan and his claim and his equal shot at fortune, was finished. The hydraulic mining operations were corporations. They required engineers, investors, capital infrastructure. They hired men at daily wages to do the work. The 49ers had been turned into employees. The same thing that happened in the railway mania. The individual speculator consumed by the corporate machine he helped to build had happened here in the mountains of California in less than 5 years. The frontier was closing. It had barely had time to open. I need to tell you what happened to John Sutter, not because his story is unusual, but because it is so perfectly, brutally illustrative of everything this series is about. The man whose land it was, the man who built New Helvetia from nothing, the man who on the morning of January 24th, 1848, before Marshall found anything, had something. An empire, imperfect and roughly built, but his. The squatters arrived first, hundreds of them, then thousands, flooding into his land, erecting camps, slaughtering his cattle for food, tearing apart his buildings for lumber. He had no legal means to stop them. California's land ownership laws were in transition following the American acquisition, and his Mexican-era land grants were contested, litigated, disputed at every level. His workers deserted for the gold fields. His crops went unharvested. His irrigation systems fell into disrepair. His fort, the commercial and military heart of his empire, was overrun by men who had no interest in anything he had built and every interest in what lay beyond it. By 1852, New Helvetia was gone. Sutter spent the next 28 years traveling to Washington, petitioning Congress for compensation, writing letters to anyone who would read them, arguing correctly, as a matter of pure legal logic, that the United States government had an obligation to compensate him for the destruction of his land and property by the gold rush it had encouraged. He received nothing. He died in June 1880 inches, a boarding house in Washington, D.C., still petitioning, still writing letters, still waiting for the country that had taken everything from him to acknowledge that it had done so. The man whose land the gold came from. He died with nothing. Let that land. By 1851, San Francisco was ungovernable. The city had grown faster than any institution could follow. There was a police force barely. There were courts, mostly corrupt. There were elected officials, many of whom had bought their elections with money from the gambling houses and saloon owners whose businesses they were supposed to regulate. Crime was epidemic. Arson was a particular problem. Fires tore through the city's wooden buildings repeatedly, and suspicion fell on gangs of Australian ex-convicts who had come to California via the Sydney goldfields, and whom San Francisco's establishment had taken to calling the Sydney Ducks. Whether the Ducks were responsible for the fires is historically uncertain. What happened next was not uncertain at all. The city's merchant class formed the Committee of Vigilance in June 1851, a private organization, no legal authority, no judicial oversight. They conducted their own arrests, their own trials, if you could call them that, and their own executions. 4 men were publicly hanged. Dozens more were put on ships and deported, sent back to Australia, to Chile, to wherever the committee had decided they had come from. The hangings were attended by crowds. When a society fills faster than its institutions can grow, someone fills the vacuum. It is never the people you would choose. It is always the people with the most to protect, the most to lose, the most willingness to use force in defense of an order that primarily serves themselves. This has been true in every city in this series. It will be true in every city this series visits. By 1855, it was over. The easy gold was gone. The hydraulic mining companies had displaced the individual prospectors. The dreamers had either made their fortune a small minority or accepted the reality that the fortune was not coming the overwhelming majority and begun the slow, defeated process of deciding what came next. Some went home, back to Ohio, to Pennsylvania, to Ireland, to Germany, to China, back to wives who had waited in debts that hadn't, back to the lives they had left, now 3, 4, 5 years older, with nothing to show for the absence except the absence itself. Some stayed, became farmers in the Sacramento Valley, became laborers in San Francisco's growing construction industry, became merchants, lawyers, politicians, the men who hadn't found gold but had found California, and understood that California, whatever it was going to become, needed people who were already there. There is a letter in the historical record from a 49er named Franklin Buck, written to his sister in Maine in 1853. I came here to make a fortune, and I have not. I have worked as hard as any man who ever lived, and the river has given me very little. I would not do this again for all the gold in California. I believe there is none left for me. He stayed anyway. He became a merchant in Weaverville, California. He never went home. There is a version of the gold rush story that ends with the miners going home and California beginning its long rise to prosperity, and it is a tidy ending, and it is incomplete, because the hills were still bleeding. Hydraulic mining dumped an estimated 1.5 billion cubic yards of debris into California's river systems between 1853 and 1884. The Sacramento River and its tributaries rose by feet as sediment accumulated. The Sacramento Valley's farmland, some of the most fertile agricultural land on the continent, was flooded repeatedly as rivers overflowed banks that the debris had raised. Fish that had sustained indigenous Californians for 10,000 years disappeared from rivers they had always inhabited. The salmon runs on the American River, once so dense you could reportedly walk across them, were gone within a generation. The towns downriver from the mining operations, Marysville, Yuba City, watched their streets fill with sand and gravel. Homesteads that had been built above the flood line were suddenly below it. In 1884, a federal court finally intervened. The case of Woodruff v. North Bloomfield Mining Company ruled that hydraulic mining companies could not dump their debris into navigable waterways without compensating the people they damaged. The hydraulic operations largely stopped. The rivers began, slowly, to heal, but the salmon did not fully return. Some debts cannot be repaid. Despite everything, despite the destroyed lives and the poisoned rivers and the 90% failure rate, and the squatters, and the vigilantes, and the racism and the violence, California became something extraordinary. This is the complicated truth at the heart of every story in this series. The bubbles burst. They always burst. The majority lose. They always lose. And yet, and this is what separates history from morality tale, what they built in the process of losing is sometimes more durable than anything they set out to build. The gold rush forced American banking infrastructure west, decades before it would otherwise have arrived. It drove the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which will matter to this series in a future episode. It created a state whose agricultural valleys, once recovered from the mining damage, became the most productive farmland in North America. It turned San Francisco from a village into a financial capital that would survive an earthquake, a fire, and a century of booms and busts to become one of the most economically significant cities on Earth. California, in 2025, is the fifth largest economy in the world. Larger than the United Kingdom, larger than India. The 49ers didn't build that. Most of them died without seeing it. But they were the reason it started when it did. The bubble burst. The foundation it laid did not. Let me give you the final accounting. Sam Brannan's store made $36,000 in its first month of the rush. He went on to become the wealthiest man in California. He owned a quarter of San Francisco at his peak. He was worth several $million. Levi Strauss died in 1902 with an estate worth $6 million. The company he founded is still in business today, 170 years later, selling the same basic design he patented in 1873. The lawyers who handled mining claimed disputes in Sacramento and San Francisco in the 1850s. Many of them became judges, senators, governors. The first fortunes of California's political class were built not from gold, but from the adjudication of other men's claims to it. The boarding house owners, the merchants, the laundresses, the cooks, and now the miners. At its peak in 1852, the average working miner in California made roughly $6 a day, better than the $1 a day of New York labor. But against the cost of food, tools, accommodation, and the debt most men had taken on to get there in real terms, for most men, in most years of the rush, it was a loss. The total gold extracted from California between 1848 and 1855 was approximately $500 million. The total amount spent by 49ers in pursuit of that gold on travel, tools, supplies, accommodation, legal fees, debt interest was, by the estimates of contemporary economists, at least as much. The gold was real. The wealth was real. It simply accumulated in different hands than the ones that dug it out. He found it. January 24th, year 1848. The mill race on the American River. The piece of gold, the size of a thumbnail, bent slightly at the edge where he bit it. He found it. What did James Marshall receive for finding it? Nothing. Worse than nothing. Men who believed he had a mystical ability to locate gold, a rumor that spread through the camps and could not be killed, followed him everywhere. To every new claim he staked, a crowd arrived behind him, assuming that where Marshall went, gold would be. The crowd destroyed every claim he made. Their presence announced the location. Their numbers stripped. It bare before Marshall could work it. He became a curiosity, then a joke, then an irritant, then, gradually, invisible. He petitioned the state of California for a pension in recognition of his discovery. It was granted, briefly, at $200 per month. Then a new legislature arrived and found it inconvenient and revoked it. He spent his later years giving lectures about the discovery to anyone who would pay to listen. Audiences thinned. The gold rush had been over for decades. The men who remembered it were old, and the men who were young did not care. James Marshall died in August, 1,885 inches, a small cabin near Coloma, California. The American River ran below, as it always had, cold and indifferent. He was buried in a hillside cemetery overlooking the site of the mill race. Broke, alone, largely forgotten. The man who found it. He never kept it. And now, because this series does not let anyone off easy, Sam Brannan, the man who understood the gold rush better than anyone alive, the man who bought the shovels before he announced the gold, the man who made $1.5 million before most 49ers had even boarded their ships, the smartest man in the room. He spent it, all of it. Land speculation in Hawaii, investment in Mexican railroads that never got built, an expensive divorce. His wife, citing his chronic infidelity, was awarded half of everything by a California court, and his response was not to become more careful, but to spend the other half faster. He had a gift for seeing other men's manias clearly and absolutely no immunity to his own. By the 1880s, he was broke. By the late 1880s, he was living on the charity of people who remembered who he had been. Sam Brannan died in May 1889 with $1,400 to his name. The man who never dug a pan, the man who sold the dream, the man who stood at the entrance and charged admission to the greatest mania America had yet produced. He died with $1,400. Even the man who sold the shovels eventually bought one. 4 bubbles, 4 centuries. Amsterdam, year 1637. London, year 1720. England, year 1845. California, year 1848. Tulip bulbs, company shares, railway shares, gold. Different eras, different languages, different continents, different technologies, different assets, different men, same architecture. In every single one of these stories, there is a thing that is genuinely real, something you can hold, something that has genuine value, something that is not, at its core, a fraud. The tulip bulb existed. The South Sea Company's trade routes existed, theoretically. The railways existed. The gold existed. The fraud is never in the thing. The fraud is in the story told about the thing. The story that says, this is the moment, this is the opportunity, this is the asset whose value will only increase, and the men who move now will be rich, and the men who hesitate will regret it for the rest of their lives. And in every story, the same cast. The man who discovers the thing. He is usually destroyed by his own discovery. Marshall Sutter, the man who monetizes the discovery before anyone else understands it. He gets rich. He usually loses it. Brannan, The man who sells the tools to the men who chase the thing. He gets rich. He sometimes keeps it. Strauss and the 49ers. The ordinary men. The ones who heard the story and did the arithmetic and decided the risk was worth it. The ones who leveraged their futures against a promise that the world kept failing to keep. They lose. Not all of them, not always, but enough of them, consistently enough, across enough centuries and enough continents, that it is no longer a coincidence. It is a mechanism, and the mechanism does not care who you are, or how hard you worked, or how real the thing you chased actually was. It only cares that you believed the story. There is something specific about the gold rush that I want you to carry with you. Something that distinguishes it from the manias that came before it, from tulip mania, from the South Sea bubble, from railway mania. The American character of it. The speed, the scale, the absolute, unironic belief in the mythology of individual opportunity, even as the reality systematically destroyed it. The willingness to move to physically uproot and travel 10,000 miles on the strength of a newspaper story. The violence, the improvisation, the radical absence of the institutional frameworks that slowed the European manias down. Britain had Parliament. Britain had the Bank of England. Britain had centuries of legal precedent and class structure, and the basic conservatism of a society that has a lot to lose. California in year 1848 had none of that. California in year 1848 was a blank page, and men with capital wrote what they wanted on it. And the 49ers arrived to find that the story had already been written, and the best parts had already been given away. America was not going to learn from this. Not because Americans are uniquely foolish, but because the very qualities that made the gold rush so fast, so violent, and so destructive, the optimism, the mobility, the risk tolerance, the faith in individual action, were the same qualities that would make America the most economically dynamic nation in the world over the following century. The feature and the bug were the same thing. The California Gold Rush was the first American mania. It would not be the last. Not by a long distance. The gold is gone from California's rivers. The 49ers are old men or dead men. The hydraulic mining companies are being sued into silence. James Marshall is in a cabin near Coloma, old and forgotten, the river running below his window as it always has. Levi Strauss is in San Francisco, running a dry goods empire, very much alive, very much solvent. Sam Brannan is somewhere spending money he doesn't have. And somewhere else, not in California, not in a mine, not in a river, in a boardroom in New York, in the accounts of a railroad company, in the ledger of a bank that is beginning to understand the full scale of what America is and what America needs, the next mania is being designed. Not in gold, not in flowers, not in railway shares. In something new. In the promise that is always the same promise, that the asset is real, the opportunity is now, and the men who move first will be rich beyond the dreams of the men who wait. You know how it ends. You've always known how it ends. But the men in that boardroom don't. Or they do, and they don't care. Or they know exactly how it ends, and they have positioned themselves to be the ones selling the shovels when it does. Same pattern. New numbers. New names. New promise. We'll see you there. The story continues. The Gilded Age, the railroads, the men who turned American expansion into a financial weapon. If you watched this and felt the pattern, subscribe now. It's going to get bigger and darker and more familiar than you want it to be. See you in the ruin.